The security camera pinged at 11:14 on a Tuesday morning, and I recognized them before the image even finished loading. 23 years will age a person. It had softened the jaw, silvered the hair, bent the shoulders, but cruelty has a signature that time doesn't erase. My father Warren was looking directly into the lens the way he always looked at things he intended to own. My mother Carol stood half a step behind him, her hands folded at her waist, performing patience. I set down my coffee, walked to my desk in the Portland office, and leaned into the intercom with the same voice I use when a client's numbers don't add up. "Can I help you?" Warren pressed closer to the camera. "Celeste. We've come about the baby." I let 5 full seconds pass before I answered. "I'm sorry, whose baby? Before I tell you what happened next, I want to know you're with me. Drop something in the comments. Tell me where you are and what time it is. Stories like this one shouldn't be carried alone." Pendleton, Oregon. 23 years ago. The kitchen smelled like pot roast and the particular silence that precedes catastrophe. I was 16, a junior in high school, and I had spent the drive home from the clinic rehearsing what I was going to say. I had notes. I had a plan. I believed in the catastrophically optimistic way that teenagers believe things that my parents would be frightened but ultimately decent. My name is Celeste Vance, or it was for the first 17 years of my life, before I legally changed it. My father, Warren, was a county commissioner with political ambitions and a reputation he tended like a private garden. My mother, Carol, was the kind of woman who described every major decision in terms of how it would appear to people at church. I had calculated, incorrectly, that their love for me was stronger than their investment in appearances. I sat at the kitchen table and I told them. Warren set down his fork. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the thing about him. His cruelty was always conversational. He told me what I had done to his name. He told me how it would look at the county offices, at the church, at the homeowners association spring dinner. He spoke about my pregnancy the way he might describe a structural defect in a property he was trying to sell. Then he opened his wallet and placed $40 on the table. Not handed. Placed. Like a tip. "That will get you a bus ticket," he said. "Use it tonight." I looked at my mother. She was looking at the centerpiece, a ceramic rooster she'd bought at a craft fair, as though it had said something interesting. She never looked at me. Not once during the entire conversation, and not when I walked past her to go upstairs and pack what I could fit into a canvas duffel bag. Not when I came back down. Not when I opened the front door. The last sound I heard from that house was the deadbolt engaging behind me. The rain that night was the specific kind that doesn't feel dramatic. Just cold and constant and indifferent. I stood on the front step and looked at the $40 in my hand and thought, with a clarity I didn't expect, they just told me exactly what I'm worth to them. I folded the bill carefully, put it in my shoe so it wouldn't get wet, and started walking. I ended up in Portland 3 days later through a combination of bus transfers and a ride from a woman named Dottie. The shelter where I eventually landed was run by a woman named Ruth, who had the particular quality of people who have survived enormous things. She was very calm and she didn't waste words. She found me a cot. She found me an appointment. She sat across from me when a social worker explained my options, and she held my hand without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. I lost the pregnancy 4 months later. Preterm complications, the doctor said, exacerbated by the stress and the period of malnutrition at the beginning. I sat in a recovery room and held a paper cup of juice that I couldn't taste, and I made a decision that I didn't articulate to anyone at the time. I was going to become someone that no one could discard. Ruth helped me get my GED. I worked the shelter's administrative desk during the days and studied at night. I discovered that I had a facility for systems, for the way information moves, for the places where records contradict each other, for the gap between what an organization claims and what its documents prove. I got a scholarship to a community college program in health information management, then a position at a regional hospital network, then a consulting contract, then a firm. By the time I was 32, Vance Compliance Group was auditing hospital systems across the Pacific Northwest for billing irregularities, coding fraud, and regulatory violations. I was not a person who found problems. I was a person who found the evidence that other people had spent considerable effort hiding. The distinction mattered, professionally and personally. I understood the architecture of concealment. I had grown up inside one. What Warren didn't know through all of this was that I had been watching. Not obsessively. I had a life, a business, a small house near the river with a garden I was slowly learning to tend. But periodically, professionally, I checked. Warren had leveraged my name on a co-signed medical debt before I left. A bill from a procedure my mother had the previous year, filed in both our names without my knowledge. I found it 6 years after leaving Pendleton, when I was attempting to refinance a business loan. I didn't report it. I paid it off through an LLC and kept the documentation. Then I set a quarterly reminder to check his credit activity. Because I understood something that Warren, for all his political instincts, never grasped. Held information is power. The difference is patience. Their empire, such as it was, had been decaying for years. Warren's political career peaked at county commissioner and stalled when a campaign finance irregularity, not one I engineered, I simply watched, surface during a state Senate run. Carol's social standing in Pendleton was underwritten by the appearance of a financial security that the actual account balances didn't support. They were performing solvency. I had seen that particular fraud pattern in a dozen healthcare organizations, and I recognized it immediately. What pulled them toward me finally was the Ruth Holloway Foundation endowment. When Ruth passed, she left the shelter to a board of directors and named me as the primary institutional donor in her will, a provision I hadn't known about until the estate attorney called me. The endowment was substantial. It was also public. Warren had Google alerts. The morning they appeared on my security feed, I had already been in the office for 2 hours. I let them stand in the rain for 4 minutes before I buzzed them up. Not out of cruelty, I simply needed the time to send 3 messages, one to my attorney, one to my lead analyst, Daniel, and one to a contact at the Oregon State Police Financial Crimes Unit, whom I'd worked with on a hospital fraud case 2 years prior. Then I went to the door. Warren had dressed for the occasion, the way he dressed for county meetings, blazer, collared shirt, a watch I remembered from childhood. Carol was in a wool coat. They had rehearsed this. I could see it in the way Warren arranged his face into something approximating warmth. "Celeste," Carol said, reaching for me. I stepped back and gestured toward the sitting area. "Come in." I offered them water. I sat across from them. I let Warren talk. The version of events he presented was extraordinary in its construction. He and Carol had spent years, he said, regretting what happened. They had never stopped thinking about me. And now, learning about the foundation, understanding the work I was doing with displaced youth, his voice cracked here. A skilled crack, practiced, they felt called to make amends. To be part of the family again. Starting, of course, with the grandchild. Carol produced a folder. Inside was a printed proposal from a communications firm called Meridian Strategy Group. A full narrative arc for a public reconciliation. Press release, interview framework. A suggested social media rollout. They had budgeted for a photographer. "The story writes itself," Carol said. A daughter who overcame adversity, reunited with her family. People respond to healing. And for the child, to have grandparents, a name with history. "There is no child," I said. The room resettled itself around those 4 words. "Celeste," Warren started. "I lost the pregnancy 22 years ago," I said. The complications were a direct result of the first 4 months, during which I had inconsistent access to food and no prenatal care, because I was 16 years old and I'd been put out of the house with $40. I paused. "I'm telling you this not because I expect it to mean anything to you now, but because I want you to understand the precise nature of what you came here to use." Carol's hand went to her mouth. Warren's face moved through several arrangements before settling on something that might have been indignation. "That's not why we came," he said. "I know why you came," I said. "I've been doing forensic audits for 19 years, Warren." The folder Carol brought. "Meridian Strategy Group invoiced you 11 days ago. You made a partial payment from a joint account that's been overdrawn twice in the last quarter. You needed the optics of a reconciliation story, because the alternative is explaining to Pendleton County why your real estate partnership's LLC filed a fraudulent property assessment last spring, an assessment incidentally that I flagged to my contact at the State Financial Crimes Office yesterday. He stood up. Carol made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I'm not angry, I said. And I meant it completely, which was the strangest part. I was angry for a long time and it was useful. It was fuel. But I'm not performing anything for you today. I'm just telling you what the record shows. They left. Warren didn't speak. Carol looked at me once at the door. And what I saw in her face wasn't guilt, exactly. It was the look of someone who had just discovered that the property they thought they owned had been sold years ago to someone they didn't know. The fallout was not dramatic. Drama requires an audience that cares. Warren's real estate partnership collapsed under the weight of the assessment investigation. Meridian Strategy Group quietly dropped the account. Carol moved to a rental in Bend. Warren pled no contest to a reduced filing fraud charge and paid a fine that I understood from the public record, effectively zeroed out what remained of their savings. I drove to the coast on a Saturday in November and walked out to where the waves came in flat and gray against the basalt. I had the $40 bill in my pocket, the actual bill, the one I'd dried and kept in a fireproof lockbox for 23 years. Evidence of the original transaction. I stood there for a while. I didn't feel victorious. I felt, more than anything, tired in the good way. The way you feel when a project that has required sustained, careful attention is finally and properly complete. I let the bill go. It rose briefly, caught the wind off the water, and was gone. That night I drove back to the shelter on Morrison Street, the one Ruth built, the one I now help fund. I sat at the intake desk for a few hours and read through the new applicant files. Young people, most of them, with the particular combination of resilience and bewilderment that comes from discovering that the people obligated to protect you have decided not to. I didn't see cases. I saw the specific aftermath of the same original lie, that belonging must be earned and can be revoked. Ruth used to say that some people will only ever see you as something that belongs to them. The work, she said, is figuring out that their inventory was wrong from the start. I thought about that for a long time on the drive home, watching the highway lights blur in the rain. I've been asked since then whether I regret not confronting them sooner, or more publicly, or with more force. I don't. The most accurate accounting I could give them was simply the truth, stated plainly, without theater. Some debts don't need drama to be discharged. They just need to be seen clearly by the right person at the right time. If you've ever been handed a figure that someone else decided was your worth, told in $40 or 40 words or 40 years of silence exactly what you amounted to, I want to ask you something. Did you believe them? And if you did for a while, when did you stop?